as to what it looks like up there, but it is, we've got Peter Orlich, partner of Reed Smith, and Michael Allen, director of Build to Rent at Quintain. Thank you all so much for joining me today. So London and New York, two amazing cities, two powerhouse cities, often tussling at the top of, the leading destination for business. Michael, can we start with you, just because I know that you've spent time living, working in both those cities. Do you think that it's fair to say it's sort of a friendly rivalry between the two, or is there sort of real fierce competition when it comes to business acumen?
Thank you. In my experience, I don't really perceive there to be a fierce rivalry. I'd say it's a friendly, it's about a friendly competition.
Friendly competition.
Yeah.
And is that sort of across the board, would you say, across business and lifestyle and?
I mean, everyone likes to take pride in their home and brag a bit about their place being the best place. But everyone in London appreciates New York, and everyone in New York, I think, appreciates London.
Thank you very much. Peter, so Reed Smith, you guys have got offices in London and in New York. What are you're presumably London-based? I think it will come on.
I just want to mirror what you said, Reece. Basically, in relation to the rivalry, I agree with every word there. And I'd also say that lots of the investors that we represent are investing in both markets. So, but the question that I've been asked most at MIPIM this year has been, Brexit and the effects that that's going to have specifically on the London market. And there's no doubt about it, when Brexit happened, it was a shock, especially to the London, which I think was 70% for us remaining. And the first 4 months were not the best 4 months. Business was down, transactions were down. However, there was the fluctuation in the exchange rate, which made the pound fall, and there was a decrease in prices of about 10%. So foreign investors saw this as a great opportunity to invest into London. So we saw 2017 at Reed Smith, it was one of our best years at real estate because there were so many transactions and so many transactions on those flagship trophy assets. So we're more concerned now, perhaps, over the next couple of years for some of the tax regulations that are coming in relation to capital gains tax, for example, for overseas investors, rather than the effect of Brexit. But hey, we'll wait and see. I haven't got a crystal ball, but it's interesting times, but positive times.
And Giacomo, what are your thoughts off the back of that, and then obviously from the New York perspective?
Well, we don't want to be one-up to New York, so we have our Brexit, and his name is Donald Trump. No, but going back to what Michael was saying, I don't think it's a rivalry. I think both London and New York play the same role, just in a different geographic area. If you're a company looking to where to locate, regardless of your headquarters, you're likely going to want to have a location in London to serve Europe and New York to serve the Americas. So I think it's reinforcing, it's not a rivalry.
And I was going to sort of work our way through some questions and get to a point where we were sort of talking about the fact that both London and New York are currently dealing with unusual political backdrops, both in terms of Brexit and Donald Trump. But given that you guys have mentioned it, let's just go straight in there. So, I'm going to go back to you, Michael, on that, if that's okay. Amazingly powerful cities. Do you think that they have sort of the strength to withstand difficult political times?
I would have to say, of course they do. The press and the media tend to take some of these political stories and I think perhaps blow them a bit out of proportion. For our business, for our residents, for our customers, it's really just backdrop. It hasn't really affected us in any measurable way. So.
And Peter, what are your thoughts on that? I suppose looking more specifically at the Brexit issue.
Yeah, I would echo that absolutely. I've talked about it before. It hasn't put off. Yeah, the first 4 months, definitely people were a bit jittery because it was a political change that's never happened in the UK. Back at before that, people in the UK tended to forget about politics. Everything was very stable. And people used to invest into the London market because of that political stability. But the political stableness is still there. Chinese, Asian investment, Middle East investment. As I said, 2017 was one of our best years, and the inflow of that overseas American investment into the London market has still been very strong.
And Giacomo, you said before we started, don't ask me about Donald Trump, but then you brought it up, so I am going to ask. In terms of how New York is performing and that sort of, I mean, it's not what anybody was necessarily expecting. Do you think that New York will just carry on business as usual, and that this will kind of the political situation will happen above it, but not have too much of a detrimental impact?
So the short answer is yes.
That's good.
Is Donald Trump or the political instability in Washington an issue? Yes. Could it be the black swan event, something caused by that instability? Yes. But generally speaking, New York is doing very well. You mentioned about the local politics in general, and I think what's interesting in New York is the actual local politics and the institutions that we have that are designed to actually develop and control our resources and infrastructure. So you have a series of organizations that were created in the 1920s and 1960s, like the MTA, the Port Authority, that are just inadequate today to help the city develop versus the challenges it faces. Infrastructure is a big issue, and we have the MTA, which is running the subways, which was founded in the 1920s and has a board appointed by the governor of New York State. So it's become a political football between New York and Albany. The Port Authority manages buses, tunnels, bridges, airports, rail, the path, and it's just no longer able to manage the infrastructure appropriately. What they really need to do is they need to break down the Port Authority into individual entities, and then have the Port Authority just be an infrastructure bank above it. Because if we look at New York versus London, New York and London is the way I like to see it. They're faced with the same opportunity because of all the immigration, but they have the same challenge, which is how do you manage and grow the resources and infrastructure.
Michael, you were nodding along there.
I would add something that perhaps you're not aware of, is that every place has its different challenges. At least in New York City, from an investment perspective, particularly in real estate, you have the benefit of actually dealing with one city. London is a collection of 20-something boroughs, each with different rules and regulations. It makes it much more challenging for real estate investment.
That's very true. But again, going back to the Port Authority, they're managing all those infrastructure pieces, and it's a tri-state entity. So try finding consensus there.
Did you want to add something on the...
Yeah, I would just say, the planning issues that we're talking about there, they're all kind of standard issues that have always been there for these kind of markets. The one thing that we're quite concerned about is this thing that I mentioned at the beginning, is the capital gain tax reforms, and the fact that overseas investors are going to be having to pay capital gains tax on their gain once they sell. I think it's coming in April 2019. So 2018 will be interesting to see whether overseas investors get rid of their portfolios, and what happens, whether they're panicked by that, and whether, there's been some more consultation about it now, so whether in fact it gets properly implemented or not. So we'll wait and see. Interesting times.
And I think that we've touched on this a bit by what we've been talking about in the last couple of questions. But what do you think each of these cities, and I'll ask you about New York and then London, and then you can take your pick, which of the cities needs to do to really maintain such a dominant position? I mean, it seems unlikely that they're going to get knocked off the top spots, but in terms of sort of maintaining that level, Giacomo, can I start with you with New York? What do you think should be the priorities?
I think long term, you got to look at the challenges, right? You got to make sure that you address them. And I think that there's four main challenges that New York has long term. The first is climate change, and we saw Sandy and the devastation that occurred with that hurricane. A large amount of the shoreline in New York City is in flood zones. So that's the first thing that needs to be addressed. The second is affordability, because income have been very stagnant, especially at the low end of the income range, and costs have gone up. So a lot of families are actually living in dangerous conditions. They're forced to. So that's the other the other issue. Then transportation, we talked about it. And the city is addressing this. It's just that you need a lot of political alignment to bring forward the next projects that we have to put forward. And that's, the fourth issue, which I discussed, is the institutions. So addressing those four, I think, is critical for New York City.
Thank you very much. And Peter, from the London perspective.
Yeah, well, these are common issues for all big, metropolitan cities. I'd definitely say on the infrastructure side, there's been lots of talk about Heathrow Airport and extending runways, etc. So that's a major concern. And affordability, absolutely, in the London market. We've seen prices generally, the below the million mark when we're talking about residential drop over the past 6 months. And we've seen PRS schemes, co-living schemes, build-to-rent schemes becoming more and more popular for the kind of millennial kind of generation. So it's, I'd say that two very similar issues to New York as well.
Well, that sort of leads perfectly on to you, Michael. So we're talking about, housing, affordability, build-to-rent. You have experience in both cities. What are your thoughts on how they compare and how far each has to go?
Certainly, one of the main issues for not only London and New York, but most major cities is housing affordability and housing availability. And both cities have a long way to go to making sure they're able to deliver the number of new homes that are required to keep the economy ticking and to keep people coming to the city and staying to the city. Certainly, the advent of build-to-rent in London is helping by providing a large number of new homes that are broadly affordable with a lowercase a. So we'll call them accessible because they don't require a large capital outlay to get into. So that is definitely helping and part of the picture. I think another thing that London has to address is to provide enough places for school children. I think that London is really struggling with that, and that's something that the city really has to think about if it's going to continue to attract and retain global talent.
You two are both nodding along to that. Presumably that's something you agree with?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd completely agree with the education and school systems and improving that. And we as a firm represent a number of kind of new entrepreneurial companies such as a collective who are doing this kind of PRS co-living concepts in both New York and London. And they're saying times have changed. The dynamic, the younger population, the 20 to 30-year-olds, the millennials that I've mentioned before, the affordability, they look at life in a different way. They're going to be renting for quite a while because they can't afford things. So providing that kind of co-living environment for these millennials has been a real hit, and I think that will really boom over the next few years.
And sort of moving on from that point a bit and talking about flexibility in general and the way that people live and work and play and just that whole change of mindset, how flexible do you think these cities are? Talk a little bit about co-living, but, co-working and that whole idea of everything, space as a service and things being a lot more mobile. Can I start with you on New York?
Okay, so certainly the way real estate is being used has changed dramatically, and has changed in ways we haven't seen for 50 to 100 years. You think the whole concept of the office, it used to be that you had to go to the office to do your job. You couldn't do it unless you were there. You had your files there, you had your computer there eventually, you had a fax machine, you had your coworkers. Now with the cell phones and the availability of information and connectivity, you don't have to go to the office anymore. That's where the co-working comes from, is to attract people to come to the office. Nowadays, you're starting to have to offer something different because they're offering you a 24-hour connected lifestyle, right? I mean, connected workday, but they want something different when they come to work. You think about New York City, it's got the largest stock in the world in terms of office. So yes, a lot of that real estate's going to have to be repurposed to meet that need. But I think there's a big universe of assets that they're undergoing that change.
Thank you very much. Peter, how flexible do you think London is?
Yeah, well, I come from an industry, the legal industry. One would say perhaps that it's probably the least flexible of all those industries. But Reed Smith, we've got an agile working policy. People working from home, sharing workspace, et cetera, et cetera. Like we say again and like we stress again, things have changed. So, and that's why companies such as WeWork are making such a killing in the London market, you know. So, yeah, absolutely. And it's this, we go back to this point, the millennial point as well. You know, people now, millennials, 20-year-olds to 30-year-olds, have got a different way of thinking and a different way of working as well, which affects our real estate market.
Thank you very much. And Michael, again, going to ask you to sort of compare the two, you know, having lived and worked in both. When it comes to flexibility and how well these cities are able to respond to the needs of the people that live in them, what are your thoughts?
I think that particularly with the growth of the build-to-rent industry, you're seeing the house builders and developers, such as Quintain, now developing a housing product that is much more reflective of these new forms of flexible living and working. So we're incorporating workspaces into our residential buildings. We're making purposely designed and built areas that are meant for working both in the apartments and outside the apartments, but within the building. So I think that in London, with the growth of new stock, new build-to-rent stock, we are going to see sort of leveraging the benefits of that kind of architecture, which has been in place in New York for some time.
I would just say quickly about when you make reference to London as well, lenders, institutional lenders are getting very comfortable with this concept as well. PRS, build to rent, you know, co-living. Over the past year or so, they've got very comfortable with it, and they've seen that as a market that's going to be very profitable going forward. Sorry.
And again, it goes back to the theme of the 24-hour workday, where you no longer have the separation of office and residential, of your workday and your personal day. It's really a continuum, and so we're seeing really a molding of, you know, the characteristic of the real estate between office, retail, and residential.
I'm really interested in the point there that you were saying that lenders are feeling more and more comfortable with that. And we're talking a lot around what is delivered to the end user. But when it comes to, you know, the money going into all of this and the people sort of overseeing it, the property sector, the financial side of things, would you agree with that point, that there is a lot more comfort around this kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the best example of that is that our first rental scheme that we delivered, leased, and refinanced in 2016 was facilitated by the government-backed guarantee program through Venn Partners, which is sort of like a Freddie Mac or a Fannie Mae kind of a situation. But our second project, only a year later, has been refinanced through the private sector. So private lenders have definitely gotten more comfortable and are now actively lending and competitive.
TH Real Estate actually just made a loan to Mike's company for a development near Wembley. And we're doing the same in New York, where our equity business is really focused on these themes. If we're not really achieving the goal of being ahead of tomorrow's tenant demand, we're not interested.
And how is that sort of being ahead of the demand? How is that manifesting itself? How do you kind of get that mindset change going?
Well, it goes back to the assets and two things. One, the characteristics of the assets and what makes good quality real estate has changed, right? And you're going to have to develop buildings that have those kind of components. Your office building is going to have to be amenitized. You're going to have to provide concierge services and things of this sort. And the second thing is urbanization, and the change in where people are living is changing commuting patterns and are going to create new neighborhoods. And the definition of what is good location for real estate is changing. The example in New York City, there's a submarket, the meatpacking district. And it used to be literally meat packers. There was blood on the street, I remember, 20 years ago. And that market has displaced the Plaza District as the strongest office market in New York City. And we believe that's here for the next 50 to 100 years. And if you look back at the history, in the past 50 to 100 years, the Plaza District was anchored by the blue chip companies of the time. And it was General Motors in the 60s, it was IBM in the 70s and 80s, and it was Sony's in the 80s and 90s. And the executive lived nearby on the Upper East Side. Today, and for the next 50 years, we believe the blue chip companies are going to be Facebook and Google and Apple, and they're all in the meatpacking, and their executives live, in Chelsea and in Tribeca. So we're seeing this huge shift that we think it's secular, not cyclical, and that's how we want to invest. We want to be ahead of that demand.
I'm conscious we've got about 3 minutes left, so there is time for one question from the... Oh, yes. I don't know if you have a microphone. There's one just coming.
I have two questions relating to transport. One is about bicycling. Having done a lot of bicycling in both cities, how do you think they compare? I know what I think, particularly with the way London has changed recently. And also about taxis and the identity as well as the convenience that a very organized taxi infrastructure gives a city. But obviously it's changing now because of Uber and other
Oh, I thought you said
companies.
taxis. Right, okay. So who wants to start with the bikes and the bicycles?
I'll take cycling because I cycled in both cities. I now cycle in London quite regularly. It's pretty scary no matter where you go. One of the benefits of New York is that you have a network of one-way streets, so you always know which way the cars are supposed to go. Something that I have a lot of trouble with in London, particularly when you're allowed to park backwards in London. It's very confusing. So I think that New York is a little bit more straightforward as far as cycling goes, or driving for that matter.
If there's anyone listening who has any power to change that, then maybe something will happen. Okay, so moving on then. Peter, do you want to talk about the cycling or the taxis? Take your pick.
I would, not that I can compare and contrast that much, although I've been to New York quite often and we are doing projects over there. Taxis, yeah, with everything that's happening with Uber at the minute and the process that they're going through and the appeal, black cabs and the way they're reacting to that, it's a very hot political topic. So I don't know what the outcome's going to be. We'll wait and see, but I think it'll be interesting to keep a tab on it.
Giacomo.
Self-driving and the taxis. And I'll take your question a step further, which is, yeah, there's convenience, and I'm not very good at, I can't really compare the two because I don't have experience in London, but there's a lot of convenience with taxis and Uber. But the real question is what happens with the self-driving car? Because that's going to change the landscape. And we're actually going to have to change the street infrastructure because you gotta create your lane so that these cars can pull over, pick you up, and get out. So I think that's the real question is like what happens when the self-driving car, which is close, starts invading the streets.
Great, thank you very much. Well, it's bang on 25 past, so I think we're going to have to wrap up there. But thank you so much to everybody for joining us and getting through all the rain, and huge thanks to the panelists today too. Thank you.